Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Donald Trump set for high-stakes Mar-a-Lago meeting as Ukraine war reaches critical juncture. Introduction: a meeting that could reshape the war. As the war in Ukraine grinds towards its fourth year, global attention has shifted to Florida, where Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is preparing to meet U.S. President Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. The encounter, scheduled for this weekend, is being widely viewed as one of the most consequential diplomatic moments since Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022. The talks come at a time when battlefield violence remains intense, diplomatic patience is wearing thin, and political calculations in Washington, Kyiv, Moscow, and European capitals are colliding. At stake is not merely a ceasefire proposal, but the broader question of Ukraine's sovereignty, security guarantees, and the future architecture of European security. For Zelenskyy, the meeting represents an opportunity to push Ukraine's red lines directly to the most powerful decision-maker in the United States. For Trump, it is a chance to assert control over a peace process he has framed as dependent on his personal approval and leadership. Weeks of quiet diplomacy lead to a public turning point. The upcoming Mar-a-Lago meeting did not emerge overnight. It is the culmination of several weeks of behind-the-scenes negotiations involving American, Ukrainian, European, and Russian intermediaries. Those talks began in earnest in November when U.S. officials circulated a comprehensive peace framework reportedly consisting of 28 core points. Since then, that proposal has undergone multiple revisions, shrinking to a more focused 20-point plan as negotiators attempted to reconcile sharply conflicting priorities. Ukrainian officials have described the process as exhausting but necessary, while acknowledging that some elements of the draft remain deeply controversial in Kyiv. Zelenskyy has stated that the plan is nearly complete, but emphasized that the most politically sensitive issues, particularly security guarantees and territorial arrangements, can only be resolved at the presidential level. Trump's position, final authority, and strategic leverage. President Trump has made it clear that no peace proposal involving Ukraine will move forward without his direct endorsement. Speaking to U.S. media ahead of the meeting, Trump underscored his belief that Zelenskyy's proposals carry no weight until he personally signs off on them. This approach reflects Trump's broader diplomatic style, which prioritizes leader-to-leader negotiations over institutional processes. Trump has expressed confidence that he can engage both Zelenskyy and Russian President Vladimir Putin, suggesting that personal diplomacy may succeed where traditional channels have stalled. At the same time, Trump has avoided unconditional backing to Ukraine's demands. Instead, he has signaled that compromises may be unavoidable if the war is to end, language that has raised concerns among Ukrainian officials and European allies alike. Security guarantees, Ukraine's top priority. At the heart of Zelenskyy's agenda is the question of security guarantees. Ukraine has repeatedly argued that any peace agreement with unenforceable protections would merely freeze the conflict and invite future Russian aggression. Kyiv is seeking firm commitments that would deter Moscow from restarting hostilities, potentially including long-term military assistance, defense cooperation agreements, or mechanisms involving NATO countries. While full NATO membership remains politically contentious, Ukrainian negotiators are pressing for alternatives that would carry real consequences if violated. Zelenskyy has said the discussions with Trump will focus heavily on clarifying what the United States is prepared to guarantee and how those pledges would interact with commitments from European partners. Economic reconstruction and U.S. involvement. Beyond security, the talks are expected to include extensive discussions about Ukraine's post-war reconstruction. Zelenskyy has confirmed that preliminary drafts of economic agreements are already circulating, though they remain in an early stage. Ukraine's rebuilding needs are estimated to run into the hundreds of billions of dollars. Kyiv is eager to secure American investment, technical assistance, and long-term economic partnerships that would anchor the country firmly in the Western economic sphere. Trump, for his part, has framed reconstruction as an opportunity for U.S. companies, while also emphasizing accountability and oversight. The contours of any economic deal are likely to remain fluid, but both sides appear to see reconstruction as a central pillar of a post-war settlement. Territorial disputes, the most contentious issue. Perhaps the most explosive topic on the agenda is territory. Earlier drafts of the U.S. peace proposal reportedly included language that would require Ukraine to relinquish control over parts of eastern Ukraine, including areas of the Donbas region still held by Ukrainian forces. Those provisions triggered alarm in Kyiv and among European allies, who argued that such concessions would reward aggression and undermine international law. Ukrainian negotiators pushed back forcefully, resulting in revisions that softened but did not entirely remove territorial questions from the plan. Zelenskyy has made clear that he will address the issue directly with Trump, emphasizing Ukraine's constitutional obligations and public resistance to territorial loss. While he has left the door open to tactical military adjustments under specific conditions, he has repeatedly stated that Ukraine's sovereignty is not negotiable. War continues as diplomacy advances. Even as diplomats prepare for high-level talks, the war on the ground shows no signs of slowing. In the days leading up to the Mar-a-Lago meeting, Russian forces launched extensive drone and missile attacks across Ukraine. Kyiv's air defenses were activated overnight to counter long-range strikes, with reports of explosions, fires, and infrastructure damage across the capital. Residential buildings were hit, leaving civilians injured, and large portions of the city temporarily without heating during winter conditions. In eastern Ukraine, Russian glide bombs struck urban areas near the front line, killing civilians and highlighting the continued human cost of the conflict. Zelenskyy has pointed to these attacks as evidence that Moscow is using violence to strengthen his negotiating position. Zelensky's message: diplomacy must be backed by pressure. In public statements, Zelenskyy has argued that dialogue alone will not bring peace unless Russia faces sustained pressure. He has stressed that Ukraine's willingness to negotiate demonstrates constructive intent, while Moscow's continued attacks reveal its reluctance to compromise.
According to Zelenskyy, the effectiveness of any peace plan will ultimately depend on whether Russia believes that refusing an agreement carries consequences. This perspective aligns with calls from Kyiv for continued sanctions, military support, and diplomatic isolation of the Kremlin until meaningful concessions are made.
European allies and the coalition of the willing. European leaders are closely watching the outcome of the Trump-Zelenskyy meeting. Several governments, including those of the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, are preparing for renewed diplomatic efforts in early 2026 under the framework of a so-called coalition of the willing. This informal grouping of countries has pledged to support Ukraine militarily and politically while exploring avenues for peace. French officials have indicated that, at some point, direct European engagement with Moscow may be unavoidable, though opinions remain divided on timing and strategy. German lawmakers have emphasized Berlin's potential role as a bridge between Eastern and Western perspectives, particularly given Germany's economic influence and historical ties to Russia. Unresolved issues, demilitarized zones, and nuclear infrastructure. Several critical questions remain unresolved, including the possibility of demilitarized zones along parts of the front line. Zelenskyy has said Ukraine could consider withdrawing heavy weapons from certain areas if Russia reciprocates, but only under strict monitoring and enforcement mechanisms. Another major concern is the fate of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest nuclear facility. Control of the plant has shifted during the war, raising fears of nuclear accidents and energy instability. Proposals for joint or international management have circulated, though Kyiv remains wary of arrangements that would legitimize Russian occupation. Russia's position, confidence, and maximalist demands. From Moscow's perspective, the war is still unfolding on favorable terms. Russian officials continue to insist that their original demands, particularly control over the entire Donbas region, must form the basis of any peace settlement. President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly stated that Russian forces hold the strategic initiative, pointing to recent territorial gains as evidence. Russian media reports suggest the Kremlin believes time is on its side, especially if Western unity weakens or political changes alter support for Ukraine. At the same time, Russian leaders have floated unconventional ideas, including shared management of key infrastructure with foreign partners, signaling an attempt to shape negotiations on their own terms. The stakes for Trump and Zelenskyy. For Trump, the meeting offers a chance to demonstrate decisive leadership on the world stage and reinforce his image as a dealmaker capable of ending protracted conflicts. For Zelenskyy, it is an opportunity and a risk to influence a peace process that could define Ukraine's future for generations. Both leaders enter the talks with leverage, but also with constraints imposed by domestic politics, allies, and the realities of war. Whether their personal engagement can bridge the remaining gaps remains uncertain. Conclusion: a defining moment before the new year. Zelenskyy has suggested that many things can be decided before the new year, reflecting cautious optimism that progress is possible. Yet he has also acknowledged that not all issues will be resolved immediately. As the world watches the Mar-a-Lago meeting, one thing is clear. The outcome will shape not only the trajectory of the war in Ukraine, but also the broader balance of power between the West and Russia. Whether this weekend marks the beginning of the end of the conflict, or merely another chapter in a long and painful struggle, will depend on decisions made behind closed doors in Florida.